All right, welcome. It is great to have everyone here tonight. Always fun to get back after the summer. I think if you don't have a seat, we do have a couple down this side. Or if someone comes and tries to sit next to you and there's nowhere, you can point them over there. But yeah, it's great to be here. We have a teaching time every week, or almost every week, at the Grove, where we take time to dig into the Bible. We learn to think like Christians about different topics. And the thing that we're going to be doing over the at least first half or so of this semester, we're calling Listening Carefully to Jesus. And so we're going to be taking texts from one of the four Gospels. They might be a story from Jesus' life. They might be one of his teachings or one of his parables. And kind of working our way through those and learning, hopefully, how to read texts in context a little bit. But more than learning how to read, hopefully listening to Jesus and hearing what it is that he might have to say to us in our own time and place. My name is Brandon Worsham, and I have been with Focus here at UTD for, I think, about 28 years. A long time. So I was a student here for my undergraduate. I was a student here for a master's degree. So I have two business degrees. My master's is sort of in the people side of business, organizational behavior, strategy. And I also have a seminary degree. Eventually went and did that. And I love the Bible, and I love college students, and I love Jesus, and I love seeing where all of those things come together. And so I don't do all of the teaching here, but I will do the first 2 or 3 weeks as we get going and kind of lay us out into what we're doing this semester. So again, UTD has been a really special place. I remember sitting in this classroom my freshman year. That's how old it is. That's why it smells kind of musty. And it's been here a long time. And we've worshiped God here many, many times over the years. And I think it's been a huge blessing, and I hope it is to you as well. So if you're looking for a spiritual community on campus, we're certainly glad to have you here. And there are some other really neat ministries on campus. That's something we've prayed for a lot of years with 30,000 plus students. No one community is going to connect with everyone or have a place where everyone can be known. And so we want lots of healthy, exciting ministries on campus. And the Lord is answering that prayer. And if you're here, just maybe a friend invited you, or you're thinking about Jesus for the first time, curious about him, or maybe you grew up a little bit in church but don't really know what you think, I think this is a great place for that. One of our convictions is that it's important for you to learn to think about faith at your education level. What does it look like to you're a college student, you're a university student, and you're learning to think about a lot of fields, and certainly one particular field at that level. And I've seen over the years, especially in youth groups and things, youth groups have to kind of aim at the middle. And so by the time you're a senior, you're still often hearing like 9th grade level teaching at church, but 12th grade level teaching at school. And that was something that was really frustrating to me, I know, growing up in church. So I was kind of ready to level up. And so our hope is that this will be a place that you can begin leveling up and understanding and asking your questions. There's no taboo topics here. No one's going to freak out if you ask your scary question. And we'll wrestle through those things together. Okay, so let's talk about Mark 8. I love the Gospel of Mark. It's my favorite of the four. It's the one that I've spent the most time in, studied the most. And Mark chapter 8 is such an interesting chapter. There's some weird stuff in there, isn't it? Hopefully you noticed that as you were reading through. And so I want to walk us through it just a little bit. If you want to get back out a Bible, you can kind of follow along. We're going to spend most of our time in that text that Rohit read to us, but I want to cast a little bit of a bigger vision of what's going on here. Because we've added over the centuries all of these numbers to the book and all of these little headings, about what the section is about. And those things are great for finding stuff. They're really helpful if you're looking for something in this long book. And they're terrible for hearing what the Bible writer is actually saying oftentimes, because we start thinking all of this is divided into sections and that Mark gave us an anthology of random snippets. But he didn't. He wrote a book. And when we start breaking it up, we start missing what's coming before and after and why are these things put together. Mark had a lot of information about life with Jesus. The church has handed down that it was Peter, the apostle, the one who's, gets in trouble with Jesus in this passage that we read today, who passed on, and Mark wrote and recorded his version of the events surrounding Jesus' life and ministry. So we're sort of hearing Peter's gospel, Peter's telling of the Jesus story, crafted by Mark so that we can hear more about his message than just the words themselves. So we're obviously jumping in the middle, Mark 8 out of 16 chapters, but here we are. We start with this feeding of the 4,000. And this is kind of the less famous version of the feeding of the 5,000, right? And in fact, Jesus even references later on in this passage that earlier he's already fed 5,000 people. Did you catch that? So we've had two different feedings. And what seems significant in this one is that, and we have to go a little bit back into chapter 7 to see this, is that Jesus is in a new area. So the feeding of the 5,000, it has a lot of the same beats and details, except when he feeds 5,000 people, he's clearly in the area where all of the Jews are living. He's doing this with his people, the Jewish people that already know God. But in chapter 7, we have this interesting scene where this Gentile woman comes. She's kind of an outsider. And one thing you find as you read through the Gospels is that no one out-talks Jesus. Like Jesus is constantly, I was even thinking next week we might look at the text, very famous text about give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give to God what's God's. Because Jesus has all these debates with the most educated people of his day, and he always comes out on top. He's always got an answer that we're still talking about 2,000 years later. That they would try and trap him in his words, and no one could do that. But Jesus has this encounter with this woman who's wanting healing for her daughter. And she asks, and he says, no, it's not right that we give to the dogs what was meant for the children. And you're like, oh man, I thought Jesus was like a nice guy. And this is kind of what he says to her. He's kind of like, no, I came for Israel. That's my mission. And she says, yeah, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that the kids drop. And he's like, okay, I'll heal her. And you see this shift because what happens immediately after is now Jesus is in this Gentile area, and all of a sudden he's going to feed another group of thousands of people. And this is not where the Jews live. This is where the Gentiles live. It's very unlikely that thousands of Jews have traveled across to find him. He's feeding in this new area. He's feeding a different kind of crowd. There's an expansion of his mission and who he's trying to reach with it. And so he does this thing. He feeds these people, fewer people. He starts with a little bit more loaves. And then right after this, the Pharisees are sort of a religious political party, sort of in their world. Everything, religion and politics are much more intermixed. There's no separation of church and state kind of thing. And the Pharisees are they're your standard evangelical Christians in a lot of ways. They're sort of middle class. They are not really in political power at this time. They're the minority party. And they are the people that are like, we've got to be serious about following God's rules. God has given us his rules. We got to be righteous. We got to make sure we're obeying all of those. That's sort of their MO. And they keep clashing with Jesus over and over and over again. But they come. He's just done this huge miracle. And what do they say? They want a sign. They want a sign from heaven. And so we kind of get, Jesus has been healing people. He's been feeding thousands of people. He's done all sorts of miraculous things. So what kind of sign are they looking for that wasn't that? Because it's very clear in Mark's telling that Jesus has been doing these things in front of them. They've witnessed these things. So probably what they're asking for is some sort of a sign of who he is, what he's going on. And you'll see in this chapter that the question is all Messiah is sort of the underlying word. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But they're wanting some sort of a sign, and he's very frustrated. He's like, I'm not giving you a sign. He gets back in the boat. He's in the boat a lot in the first half of Mark. And then we get this really weird scene where now he's in the boat with the disciples, and, he tries to give them this warning, right? Beware the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. Now, this is a strange pair. Herod is sort of the king. He's pretty godless. He's the guy who killed John the Baptist a few chapters earlier because of a, goofy promise he made to his daughter. And he's not, the Pharisees are like, we are the righteous of the righteous. Herod does not fit that group. And so you're trying to think, like, what is it that these two groups have in common? What is this? The yeast of these. And we picture yeast as like something we like tear out of a packet and pour into, our bowl when we're making bread. But they didn't have any of that. That's a very modern thing. Yeast for them it's much more like if you think about sourdough or something like that. You would keep a little bit of yesterday's dough, and then when you make dough today, you mix that in. And so you're always kind of keeping a little bit of that. And it's an image that's used over and over again in the scripture in various ways. But he says, beware of this. It's if you get a little bit of it, it's going to work its way. And probably what's going on is that the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod, these are all people who, even though they've seen these mighty works, they refuse to believe. They've seen what Jesus can do, but they refuse to believe. It may be something like that. But then the disciples are like, they don't think about it. They're like, it's because we don't have any bread. Because, if Jesus is worried about one thing in this chapter, it's like, what if we don't have enough food? Like, what just happened? And that's what he said. Like, what just happened? We didn't have enough food, and how many people could I feed? And that was the second time I did it? Like, you think this is about having enough food? And so we're walking through this thing, and we get this warning about the Pharisees and how off base they are. But lest we start thinking this is an us versus them, the very next thing Mark tells us is that Jesus' disciples don't get it either. They have no idea what's really going on. And so he tells them this. Do you still not understand? Then we get this bizarre story. Okay, this bizarre story about this man who's blind. And what happens? Jesus comes, he touches this man, and he can't quite see. He sees, I don't know how he knows what trees walking. I don't even know what trees walking around looks like. Maybe it's like in the Lord of the Rings where you have like the Ents or something. But he sees this, and then Jesus has to touch him again. And at this point, we really should be like, what is going on? Because by this point in Mark, Jesus has, healed people with leprosy. He's healed people who were paralyzed their entire life. He's healed people who couldn't hear. He's healed people who couldn't speak. He's raised dead people. He's healed a woman who has been bleeding for 12 years. He's told a storm to shut up, and it just stopped. He's walked on water. But what's really hard is healing eyes. He's not as good at it, right? He's just like, it takes him a little bit of extra. He doesn't really understand that. No, what is this story about? So we should leave this story, if we're reading Mark, we should be at this point of like, what? Like, why would it take him 2 touches to heal this guy? He's healed people at a distance. He's done all sorts of powerful things, and they've come to this conviction that he can sort of do anything he wants. And so then, that's the setup for this next scene, the one we're going to talk more about tonight. It says, Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. So this is sort of the furthest north that Jesus ever goes that we know about. Caesarea Philippi, Philip the Tetrarch, who's Herod's son, is sort of a governor of this area, and he names, not the Herod that killed John the Baptist, but that Herod's dad, Herod Sr. So Herod Sr.'s other son, Philip, has named this after Caesar Augustus, the one who came after Julius Caesar, but also after himself. His name was Philip. So he's like, yeah, it's like Caesar Philip. That's the name of the town. We'll do that. And so this is sort of this northern area, and again, you start getting the sense he's on the very fringes of where the Jews are living. There's a lot of Gentiles, a lot of more Gentile names. And but probably it's a beautiful place. People still like resort there. There's, national parks and stuff over there to go see this beautiful thing. So he gets away with his disciples. And he asks, who do people say I am? He's like, all right, we've spent a lot of time together. We've been doing a lot of things. What's the buzz? Like, what do people think is going on? And they reply, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. So John the Baptist is dead, but you have to put yourself in their shoes there's no internet. There's no way to, get this stuff. They're living in little villages all around, and there's rumors passing around of what's going on. John the Baptist was a very famous figure. And so you can imagine that when you hear that Herod killed him, you're like, maybe. But also this other guy seems to be doing a lot of the same things. Maybe that's him. Maybe he's sort of like hid and resurfaced. The disciples know that's not the case because they've been with him from the beginning. Others say Elijah. Elijah was one of the great Old Testament prophets, and in the book of Kings, you see that Elijah doesn't die. He's taken up to heaven. And so there were all these sort of myths and stories and expectation that like someday Elijah's going to come back. And from what we can tell, in between the end of the Old Testament, Malachi, and the beginning of Jesus' ministry, there's about 400 years where there's no prophets. And so the people are kind of like, we haven't had a prophet who could do miracles or do anything like that in hundreds of years. So maybe it's one of those old ones that came back. God sent one of them here. So people are thinking a lot of different things about him. He says, but what about you? Who do you say I am? And Peter answered, you're the Messiah. And Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. You're the Messiah. Messiah is one of these words that it's kind of, we've added a lot of meaning to it over time. We kind of have taken like any promise that God gave in the Old Testament, like that's a messianic prophecy. But I think that's a little bit of a misuse of some things. I think there was a lot of different things they were expecting in the Old Testament. There were prophecies about a great prophet who would come from Moses. There were prophecies about things that God was going to do. There were prophecies about things that Israel was going to do. And then there was also this prophecy about the Messiah. And it really comes, if you want to go look it up, you can find it in, I think it's 2 Samuel 7, 1 Chronicles 17 tells the same story, but the prophet Nathan comes to King David, who's kind of like, he's the top dog in terms of kings. He's the second king. The first one was terrible. Second one's pretty good, not perfect. And Nathan tells him, God is going to establish your house, and your son, one of your sons, is going to sit on the throne forever. So they've got this sense of like someone from David's line is going to be king forever. And Messiah just means anointed one. It's the same, that's the Hebrew word of the Greek word Christ. They're the same thing, Messiah or Christ. And so it means king, or the only people they anoint are kings and priests. So they're expecting this coming king. And that obviously has pretty big political implications. Because at this point, they don't have free reign. They have a king, but in name only. Because the real king is Caesar. They're a part of the Roman Empire, And they're expecting someone to come and overthrow Rome, put them in charge of the world. That's their hope. And so they've figured out he's the Messiah. And, Matthew tells this version a little bit longer, and he says, that Jesus says, this was not revealed to you by men, but by my Father in heaven. Like, you've figured out this thing. But, it says, he then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." So Mark tells us that this marked a shift in Jesus' teaching. At this point, when they are like, we think you're the Messiah, he starts teaching something that he wasn't teaching before. He then began to teach that the Son of Man, Jesus has referred to himself over and over as the Son of Man. And this, again, is another one of those weird Old Testament things, because it comes from two places. It's vague. In Ezekiel, Ezekiel is always addressed as Son of Man, and it just seems to mean like human, like I'm a human because I'm a son of a human, or you could be a daughter of a human, but Ezekiel was a man. And so Son of Man kind of just means human, but in the prophet Daniel, there's this other vision that one like a Son of Man was going to come on the clouds, and that the Ancient of Days was going to give him authority over everything forever. So it's this sort of vague term. Jesus keeps referencing this, calling himself this, but it's like, which of these does he mean? Now, by the end of the chapter, we're going to see who he's talking about, right? Because with the very last verse here, he says, "The Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the angels." This sounds a lot more like Daniel's vision than it does Ezekiel just being a human. So he says the Son of Man has to suffer. The Son of Man must suffer. So we see this interesting scene here. He uses this word, Mark uses this word rebuke actually 3 times. It's this Greek word epitomeo. So back up in verse 30 where it says Jesus warned them not to tell anyone. It's that same word. He's like speaking sternly. Don't tell anyone that I'm the Messiah. And then Peter tries to speak sternly to Jesus. We're not doing that. You're not going to suffer. We're not going to let you do that. And then Jesus speaks sternly back to him. "Get behind me, Satan." And probably what's going on here, Satan is sort of a name, but it also kind of has this more generic term of being like an opposer or an accuser. And so Satan earlier in this gospel has been the one who's tempted Jesus with an easier way. It's like, what if you just did miracles in front of the people? Jump off the temple and God won't let you die. What if you just bow down to me and I'll give you the world? You don't have to do anything. And Jesus rejects that path. And so here again, probably Peter is standing in that same place. He's tempting Jesus with the same easier way. The same easier way to go about this whole thing. And Jesus reminds Peter where disciples belong, right? Jesus is the rabbi. He's the teacher. You're following me. You're not standing in my path. You're supposed to be behind me. That's what this whole passage is about, right? The very next thing, if you want to be my disciple, you have to come with me. You have to go where I'm going. So get behind me, Satan. You're not thinking right. So this passage, I love this passage because it really is sort of the hinge that the whole gospel swings on. So many things change. If you read Mark's gospel, you'll start to see that the first half and the second half are very different. One, some of it's simple. It's like all of the big moments in the first half are on a boat. They're always on boats. They're around the Sea of Galilee. Jesus teaches them on boats. He does miracles on boats. The second half, they're on the road. They're moving towards Jerusalem. In the first half, Mark tells us that Jesus taught everything in parables. He was constantly teaching in unclear. He says all things come in parables. But in this passage, it says that Jesus began to tell them plainly. He goes from speaking in parables to speaking plainly. And you'll even see there's a little bit of humor in this because Mark will tell us as we go on that the disciples don't get what he's saying because they assume he's still speaking in parables. They're like, oh, he doesn't really mean that, right? Like, so what does it mean? The first half is sort of all about Jesus in power. I mean, we talked about that. All these incredible things. He's just demonstrated his power over creation, his power over spiritual forces of evil, his power over illness. But the second half of this book is going to be about Jesus' weakness, his choice to walk a weaker road. So almost all of the miracles in the gospel have already happened. We'll see a couple more little things, but we're on the road to the cross now. But I think even more profoundly, this first half of the book is about getting them to this moment. That the question that drives the first half of the book is, who is Jesus? Who is the Messiah? But now we're shifting gears and having to ask the question, but what has God sent the Messiah to do? Is the Messiah here to conquer? Is the Messiah here to put you in charge and make sure everyone else behaves? Or is the Messiah here to suffer? See, Peter is only the first person among many to stumble over the idea of a suffering Messiah. He's just the first person to not like that idea. And Jesus isn't just telling them that he's going to do something. He's telling them that he's leading the way and they're going to go with him. That this is the path. That the cross isn't just for Jesus alone. It's a new way of life for his followers. And this has major implications. It had implications for their politics, as we've been talking about, that they weren't going to get to be in charge. And that's something that they are wrestling with, that theirs is going to be a race to the bottom. Later on in this gospel in chapter 10, he's going to say, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord over people, but that's not going to be your way. The greatest will be the servant of all. But it has political implications now. We still fall into that same thing often, even as God's people, that we just like, if we just had a little more power, we could make everyone do what we think they ought to do. But that was not the way Jesus took. It has serious relational implications. I had a girl that I actually met at the first Friday night of the year, a number of years ago, and she texted me recently, and she was like, I was thinking this week, I was reading this scripture in 1 Corinthians 6. It's like I was thinking back to my first year at UTD, and I'd had all these conflicts with my roommate, and you kind of said, took me to 1 Corinthians 6 and was like, yeah, Paul says, why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be mistreated? Like this is the path of the cross, that we suffer because other people are sinning and that we don't fight back. And she goes, and I thought you were insane. And she said, but now reading it 10 years later, I'm starting to see what Jesus was doing. It calls us to a different way of relating. It has spiritual implications of what do I really think God is like? That's what 1 Corinthians 1 and 2 is all about. If you want something to go read in your alone time this week, Paul is like, we think we get God figured out, and we think because he's so powerful, that he would use power the way we would use all of that power to make everyone do stuff. But what we found out at the cross is that God is the God who would die for his people. He's super unfair, but always in our favor. He's different than we expected. And so what I see in this is that knowing and believing Jesus is the Messiah isn't enough. they had to also accept the necessity of his suffering and accept that path for themselves. And that's what I would say to us. So often we think Christianity or following Jesus is about having these right answers, knowing the secret, knowing the information, getting all the check boxes right. But I think what we see here is knowing who he is isn't enough. This is what James says. He's like, you believe there's one God, good. Even the demons believe that, except they just shudder when they think about it. It's not enough to have the right answers. We have to decide, are we actually here to learn from Jesus or just learn about him? Who do people say Jesus is now? I got a couple minutes. Who do people say Jesus is now? What do you hear? What? A good teacher, yeah. A prophet, yeah. Some people, Lord and Savior, absolutely, yeah. What was it? A magician, absolutely, yeah. A fake, yeah. What wasn't even real? This was kind of a myth or something like that, yeah. A colonizer, yeah. We do love taking modern concepts and forcing them back on ancient people. That's one of our favorite pastimes, yeah. A prophet, right? King of Kings, Kenny? A Marxist, yeah. I mean, he's been co-opted for so many different political movements and things like that. People say Jesus is a lot of things. But I think Mark wants us to hear this same question that Jesus turns, that he looks at his disciples and says, but what about you? Who do you think I am? And he wants us to see that getting that answer right isn't enough. Even if you get that answer right, it's not enough. If you give the right answer, are you going to turn around and immediately say no to the path that he invites you to walk? Because we often do. But he's inviting you to walk a path with him. And it's a path not just to suffering. He tells us that it's a path to life. Whoever wants to save his life has to lose it. And if you try to save your life, you will lose it. These disciples were not easily convinced. And you see this if you keep reading in the rest of the gospel. Jesus telling them this doesn't sell them on it. They had to walk with him and see. They had to walk with him and see where this path goes. And Jesus invites us to walk that same path. Praise team, you guys can come back up. So again, I give you this tonight because I do hope that you'll take some time to read Mark's gospel. It's the shortest of them. You could read it in a week, easy. And to reflect on the idea that this chapter is sort of the hinge. Everything swings on it. But I think this lesson can also be a hinge point in our own lives. Who do I think he is? What do I think he came to do? And what do I think he's inviting me to do? And we'll keep exploring that in the coming weeks. God, I pray that you would bless us as we try to reflect on Jesus, try to see who he is. I thank you for Mark and the other evangelists who are so careful to record these stories, to put them in order, to help us reflect and understand this information, and to see at least the claims that they're making so that we can evaluate them for ourselves. I pray that we would be a people who are willing to walk in the way of Jesus, not to try to seize power and use it for ourselves like so many do, but to see a different way. We pray these things in his name. Amen.